Well, thank you everybody for coming. I wanted to get a quick poll to get a sense for what the knowledge level on this is. I've noticed that there tends to be very large differences in people's levels of knowledge as to what's going on. So how many people are currently writing or trying to automate an iOS app? Okay, how many people are writing or trying to automate an Android app? Okay, how many people have ever used iWebDriver, the iPhone driver for Selenium? What about for Android? Okay, so it seems like this is going to be a lot of new stuff for most people, but for those of you who are already trying to do this stuff, hopefully I dive deep enough into it that there's some clarity and new information for you. So without any further ado, hi, my name is Jason Carr. I work at Sauce Labs. While I'm presenting, feel free to heckle me. This is my Twitter handle. Additionally, this is the best way to get a hold of me if you have any questions or if you just want to chat. I am happy to get together with you and have a beer and talk about mobile stuff, because that's my passion. So most of you are probably like, Monty Normsby, what the heck? So I put this next slide in. Whoa, too far. That is Monty Normsby, the cow, not the dude. Monty Normsby was the 1926 homecoming queen at The Ohio State University. She won because all the other candidates were disqualified. When I was in high school, I thought this was hilarious. Hence, it is my screen name everywhere. And as you all know, once you pick a screen name, you can never go back. It's irrevocable. So I will forever be a Holstein cat. No, really, I'm a developer. What I do at Sauce is I make our mobile Selenium implementation work. But I'm also a contributor to Selenium and Appium, which is why you should care that I'm talking about this. I've worked on the WebDriver application for iOS and a little bit on the Python bindings with regards to touch actions. And I've worked on Appium a little bit. And I'm going to be working on Appium a lot more because I think it's a great tool. So let me set a little bit of context for this talk before we go forward. What I'm going to do is cover a couple different approaches to mobile testing, both on the web and on native. Hopefully those approaches are general enough that they apply to iOS and Android. I think they do. I gave this talk, or something similar to it, last night in San Jose. How many people were there last night? A couple of you.
Bummer, I live in Campbell.
Gotta watch both of the meetups then. Basically, I added Android to the talk because somebody came up afterward and was like, you didn't say Android one time. I was kind of chagrined. So we're going to talk about Android today too. But what I'm really doing is trying to set a context so that we can talk about what the next generation of tools should look like. Because a generation of tools that I think is sufficient has finally arrived. I think that they will do the job. And I think that means that the next thing we have to do is set our sights on what the generation after this is going to look like. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what that's going to be. So let's start by talking about the mobile web. So for mobile web, WebDriver just works. There's very few problems on mobile web that you can't solve with WebDriver. They're there. There are definitely things you can't do, but they're few and far between. This is what WebDriver looks like architecturally. You have your script. That script will either go directly to a WebDriver app or it will go to a Selenium Grid hub and then talk to the iWebDriver app, which is actually running on the device. So in order to make this work, you have to launch the WebDriver app. You have to figure out what port it's running on. You have to register it with the Selenium Grid. You have to tell your script to talk to the Selenium Grid, and then you should be good to go. For the purposes of what I'm going to do, let's pretend we're not working with a Selenium Grid. We're going to pretend that we're just talking directly to the app. So it's single thread, one test at a time, talking directly to the WebDriver app. What might a script that does that look like? Here's a script. It's in Python. I apologize if you're not a Python person. I just think Python reads really cleanly, so I use it for my examples. So this example, just to walk through it really quick, we import WebDriver. We tell it where the Selenium Grid hub is. That's what that URL is. By default, the iWebDriver application starts up on port 3001. I don't know why it starts on 3001, but that's where they chose to put it. Android starts on port 4443 by default, maybe? I'm not 100% sure, but you have to check that. If you're using Android, you need to know what port it starts on. Then you have to send a desired capabilities object. Fun fact, in Python, that object is just dictionary, just like you would send if you built it yourself, and it includes the string for browser name as iPhone. So that's what I'm setting there is the capabilities I want. And then the driver line is just me invoking a remote WebDriver and passing in my parameters, and that's it. I would have a functioning WebDriver instance on the phone. It really is that easy. This should look exactly the same as if you were trying to invoke a Firefox instance on your local.
Are your slides anywhere to be found?
I'll put a link on the meetup after what I don't have them up right now. Sorry, I was a little too last minute. So a couple things to note about this. It doesn't matter what capabilities you send to the iWebDriver instance. If you're interacting with it directly, it'll still work. You can send it an empty dictionary. It'll still work. Because it completely ignores whatever you send it. So if you tell it you want Firefox, it's still going to give you iPhone. Yeah, actually, in fact, it has no idea what it's running on. It just knows it's an app and it's running. It doesn't know that it's on an iPad. It doesn't know that it's on an iPhone. And this is what you get once you've launched it. You get an empty white screen with a status bar at the bottom. This is good. This means it worked. What you're going to do then is use your WebDriver commands to drive it and make it run. And sorry, if you're still using Selenium RC, you can't use that here. It's WebDriver. So what is the limitation of this? What can't it do? Iframes don't work. If you have a like button on your page, you cannot probably click that like button because it's probably embedded in iframe. The driver.switch to frame command in Python, it's driver.switch to .frame or something in others. It just doesn't work in iOS. It's a limitation of the way that it's implemented. Driver.quit does basically nothing. If you send driver.quit to a hub, it'll still end the session like it normally would, and you won't be able to access the session anymore. But if you send driver.quit directly to the app itself, it does nothing. It doesn't delete cookies, it doesn't delete the history, it doesn't create a new session. So you are effectively going to have to shut down the iWebDriver instance every time you want a new one. Alert handling doesn't work at all. And there's issues executing JavaScript. So a lot of the different JavaScript commands you would normally pass to it won't work. Probably the best example of this is if you try to pass it JavaScript that would execute in another frame, it won't work. There's some other limitations here and there. These aren't the only limitations with this. There's certain Unicode characters that don't translate, and if you try to send them, you'll end up with like a t-shirt or a bicycle or a pile of poo. Why? That's the number one question I get asked. Why are these limitations present? So to understand this, you have to go back to the architectural decision to write an application as the driver. If you're familiar with WebDriver and you used it with, say, Firefox, you're actually running in the browser. Here, you are not running in the browser. Here, you're running in what's called a UI web view. So if you've done any iOS development, you've ever interacted with a hybrid app, that's effectively what WebDriver is. It's a hybrid app that you can remote control and drive wherever you want. So that's why all these limitations are present. And the most important problem with JavaScript, the reason I have this slide, the JavaScript engine that powers mobile Safari, it's called Nitro, it does not work in UI web views. It falls back to the generic WebKit implementation. So you do not have real-world performance for JavaScript evaluation like you would in mobile Safari. So if you're running iWebDriver, you're going to get much slower JavaScript than if you use mobile Safari. But the tool's pretty good. It mostly works. So let's move on to native iOS first. Did you have another question?
Yeah, just a quick one. So, I mean, you're involved with iOS developers all the time, right? Is it a big deal to them not to have those capabilities?
No. Generally, the reaction I've gotten is it's good enough. The iframe stuff is really annoying. If that's something you specifically need to test, it's sorry. JavaScript being slow is a pain, but if you run your tests in parallel, it doesn't matter. So it's a mixed bag. You know what's really annoying to me is it doesn't handle HTTP a site that has basic auth on it, it just white screens. It doesn't give you any feedback as to what's going on. So the only way I've found to diagnose that for sure is to set a breakpoint in Xcode and watch it go through and see where it catches. It stinks, but yeah, most of the time people don't care. All right, so moving on to UI automation. Has anybody used UI automation? Do you guys like it? Not really? Yeah, it sucks. Let's talk about UI automation. UI automation, for those of you who don't know, is Apple's officially supported tool for automating iOS applications. Yes, there is such a thing, even though you've probably never heard of it. It's a JavaScript framework that only runs through instruments.app. So here's how it looks. Oh, sorry. I love this quote. Alex Vollmer said this. Using UI automation is a bit like being dropped off in a field somewhere with no map, tools, or supplies and being told you need to build a house. I think he understates the issue. I think it's actually much worse than that. So this is what this framework looks like. You write your JavaScript test, and you execute that JavaScript test in Instruments. And Instruments talks directly to the app using privileged APIs that only Apple is supposed to have access to. The protocol is completely a mystery to me, how it actually communicates back and forth. But what I do know is that on the iOS side, it's triggering native events. So it's actually simulating a real touch on the screen when you send tap using the JavaScript framework. This actually causes a lot of problems because Instruments was never really designed to have a test harness or a test runner or anything like that. Their vision of what this looked like is you write one long JavaScript file with all your tests in it that can execute serially, and then you push that into Instruments, and it executes all the tests and then outputs logging information that you gave it. So for example, to record a pass, you actually pass it a log test pass function, and it'll put pass next to that test once it passes. If it's failed, then you have an else block where you have log fail in it. And it's really silly because we already created things that can handle this in JavaScript. There's already JavaScript unit testing frameworks that can handle these things, but we're not allowed to use them. So what ends up happening is, because you have to operate in this restricted subset of JavaScript, people are re-implementing tests. People are re-implementing test runners and test collectors and test harnesses. And it's a real pain because you have to jury-rig everything just to get tests, plural, to run. So this is sort of a key part of this model. The good thing about it is everything happens on the client side. You don't have to modify your app. You don't have to do anything special with your app except build the app so it's accessible. If you're building an accessible app, this will just work. If you're not building an accessible app, shame on you. Go build an accessible app. That's it. So like I said, UI automation only runs in instruments.app. All the reasons I mentioned why this are bad. You can't reuse code. You can't use test runners that already exist, and you can't even use the definition like a test function that exists in some of the most basic unit test frameworks. Tests have to be in JavaScript. This wouldn't be so bad, except UI automation strips out all the fun parts. You can't make any HTTP requests. You can't do a lot of the things that we take for granted as parts of our test. Even more bad is that there's no real-time interaction with your test, so you can't pause your test in the middle and then go interact with your database and then come back to the test. So your tests are completely asynchronous. You have to push them into instruments. They all run, and then you get output. As I mentioned, it's hard to reuse your code. There's only one test at a time. So if you have 500 tests, they have to run 500 in a row unless you want to take your test suite, break it up into chunks, and run it on different machines. So it's bad. I want to insert an aside here about Android automation. This is going to sound a little bit token, but I don't think Android automation deserves having its own talk right now because it's very nascent. The patterns that are being used on the iOS side are the exact same patterns that are being used for Android. And there's really only two tools of note right now on the Android side, in my opinion. The first tool is a tool called Robotium. this. Basically, Robodium is a wrapper around the officially supported Android Monkey Runner test tool. And what it does is it subclasses some of the classes that you use for Monkey Runner tests, and it lets you compile those tests into the app and upload that app and run it. It's an okay idea, but it's all device side. The other tool is Monkey Runner itself, which I actually would recommend if you need to automate the Android app right now. I really don't think there's anything better for you to use. Some people have switched to using frameworks that are where you embed an HTTP server into your app and then communicate with that. There's a variety of reasons I think that's a bad idea, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But those principles are the same for Android and iOS. So if you came here tonight to automate, and you're like, I don't know how to automate an Android app, check out Monkey Runner. Two things about it. One, it's not the same thing as Monkey. There's an Android tool called Monkey that sends random input to your device. This is different. This actually lets you write tests. Secondly, the test suite will be almost entirely in Python. Monkey Runner's API is built in Python for you to interact with. So it's actually very easy, very clean, very simple. There's lots of great unit testing frameworks in Python, so it really shouldn't be that hard to get up and running in a short time. So, moving on. So here's where I admit, I'm not the first person to try to scale this mountain. Many other people have, I'm actually going to say many other people have died trying to take this hill. And I don't claim to have all the answers. I'm also going to die trying to take this hill. But I might get a little farther up because of what other people have done. So let's look at what the other approaches have been and what I think has been unsuccessful about them. Till now, I think there's been two major approaches to automation. The first one, it looks like this. Basically, what you do is you write a script that interacts with a framework, probably written in a DSL, that interacts with a screen capture from the device. So that's a VNC, most likely. For mobile, it's definitely VNC, which means you have to jailbreak the device to use this. Or you can run it in an emulator and have it on your local display, and it can interact with that. So the tools that behave this way, Sakuli is probably the big one that comes to mind. They're really useful. They can automate the whole device. No other framework can claim that. And so that's a really big deal. But as an everyday testing tool, there's some pretty major issues with this. The big one is that it's hard to abstract these tests because they're screenshot based. And abstracting your screenshots can be very difficult. In addition, they're very brittle. Your designers are going to tell you they want to redesign things, and you're going to tell them no because it will break your test, or because you don't want to sit and take 600 screenshots again. It's really hard to use this with real devices. If you want to use something like Sakuli with a real device, there are guides out there. There are people who have figured it out. It involves installing a VNC client on the device, figuring out how you're going to send the commands to the device, and then getting that whole rig set up, and good luck doing that in CI. Hard to use it in CI. It's hard to parallelize. It's just really hard to get this working across at scale, which you need. So this is the second model. This is way more popular than the first. There's a lot of tools that use this model. Native Driver is the most prominent of the last generation of tools. Of course, Native Driver is abandoned. I'm going to call this the Native Driver model. Basically, you write a script that interacts with a specialized client library of some kind. That could be Selenium. And then it talks to an HTTP server that's embedded in the application itself. So for iOS, this involves creating a new target, putting all of the files for the HTTP server into that target, and hopefully it all works. And then you get it onto your emulator because it's really hard to use it on a real device. And you cross your fingers that nothing breaks, because if it does, you have to debug the HTTP server and your application. So the problems with this: one, it requires code modification, and for a lot of people that's just not going to happen because they're handed an APK or a .app file by their engineers, and they have to figure out how to test it. So if you don't have access to the source code, you can't use this model at all. Additionally, real devices, you just can't do it. It's really hard. Again, there are people on the internet who have it working on real devices. There may be people in this room who have it working on real devices, and I'm sure that they will tell you that it is very hard and it is very difficult to scale. You're learning probably a new framework with new tests, or at the very least a new client library, and you're writing new tests for that, so code reuse is low. So here's where I get to the part where I die on the hill. I'm going to tell you what I think the right way to automate iOS is. And I say iOS, some of these principles apply to Android just as well. The first thing that I would love everybody to do is to remember the testing pyramid. I'm going to go way back here for a second. If you remember the testing pyramid, you get something that looks like this in its most simplified form. Most of your tests are unit tests. You have some subset of tests that are service tests, and then a smaller set that are end-to-end UI tests. Everything that I just talked about falls in the top part of this pyramid, and it should be the least of your concerns if you don't already have unit tests. And it's shocking to me how many mobile developers don't think they need unit tests for some reason. I don't understand. It's like you get off the desktop, and all of a sudden, we don't need to test. That's totally a backwards way of doing things. So, are you writing unit tests for your apps? You should be. It's not that hard. Once you've done that, go ahead, write some tests for your controllers. Mock out things to get your controllers tested so that you don't have to have end-to-end tests and be relying on those. Okay, so if you're working with a hybrid application, probably you don't need to have a super robust functional testing framework because you can just use iWebDriver to test your UI web views. And it should work just fine. It's actually the exact same engine that's actually testing, or actually running your UI web views. So you're sure, you can be proof positive that it's going to render the same. And the WebDriver API is just really nice. It's a lot nicer than UI automation. So I would recommend using that. So most of you, I think, are saying like, okay, cool, I get it. That's a lot of information, but we're doing all that stuff. What should we actually do if we want to be testing apps today? I think if you have a native application and you want to be testing it end-to-end, the best tool for you to be using is going to have these things. One, it's going to allow you to reuse your code. You're going to be able to abstract things and have nice reusable code where you only have to change things in one place when you have a change. It's going to give you real-time interaction with your tests. That means breaking out of JavaScript. You cannot be stuck in JavaScript. UI automation specifically. JavaScript, nothing against it, it's great. But this breaks you out of UI automation. You should be able to use it with CI. You should be able to use it with your existing automation frameworks. And it should support parallel tests in real devices. And when I say support real devices, it shouldn't be the hardest thing in the world to get them running. So what should you use? I think the tool that we should be using is Appy. And I'm sure nobody's ever heard of this. Appium is an open source tool that wraps UI automation. And that means it can be extended. It means if you don't see something that you want in the tool, you can write it. Additionally, it uses the WebDriver API. So this is really cool. It means that if you want to write tests, you just use the WebDriver gem, or use the Python WebDriver library, or use the Java library. And you don't have to learn a new library for your tests. So you can write Cucumber tests that interact with the WebDriver gem, and voila, you have tests that run an app. It's real time. So I mean this in two ways. One, you can pause a test and go do other stuff. You can, you have the full power of whatever language you're writing in. So whatever testing framework you're using, it can do all the things that you expect it to do. But I also am talking about the fact that it has a JavaScript interpreter built into it that you can use to examine how the UI automation commands it's sending behave in real time. It works with real devices. This is sort of beta, but it's going. It works. The reason it works with real devices is because UI automation works with real devices. So it's officially Apple supported that it works with real devices. And it works in parallel architecturally. The reason I say this is that it's not actually built for it to plug into Selenium Grid, but nothing is preventing us from making it work with Selenium Grid. So it could work in parallel. And then finally, probably the biggest point in its favor, it doesn't require code modification. So you don't have to change the app or the APK in any way to make this work, except making it accessible, which you should already be doing. So here's what it looks like. Effectively, you write a test script in your test framework of choice, and you use that command executor that I talked about earlier to point it to the Appium server. The Appium server takes the commands that it receives and sends JavaScript commands to instruments.app, which has been bootstrapped so that it can receive commands on the fly rather than having to have them all uploaded into it. And then it talks to the app. And so all your commands are first-class citizens. They're all executed by Apple's touch testing framework that already exists on the device. It's that simple. So it's pretty easy to get started. You clone it. You install Bottle, which is the micro framework that it runs on top of. And then you invoke the server. That's it. That's all it takes to get it going. You do have to have Xcode installed and the developer tools so that you have instruments in the simulator. But other than that, this is all it takes to get started. And this is what a test might look like. So a lot of this should look familiar because till the fourth line, it's exactly the same as the stuff I was showing you before. And these are just WebDriver commands underneath. So it's really simple to get it working. And I'm going to prove it. So the first thing I have to do is I have to launch my server so that we can talk to instruments. Oh, yep.
It's also command line tool, right?
I'm sorry?
This is a command line tool, right?
Appium? Yeah, it's a server that runs on your workstation. So this can be, if you're using a Selenium grid, you would just configure machines that have this running on them talking to the grid. So I put a little bit of a debug in there so that you can see the actual command that gets it invoked when you launch the server. I'm sorry for the people whose view I'm blocking. I can't get out of the way. But you can see it's launching instruments and it's passing it a bunch of information. Among the most important information it's passing is the UIA script variable, where it passes this bootstrap.js file in. And what that does is it bootstraps instruments and prepares it to receive commands from Appium.
Do you make it bigger?
Yep. Is that better? Okay. So you can see at the bottom it's listening on port 4723 on localhost. So if I'm going to switch over to this other side, make it a little bigger. I'm just going to open up my Python interpreter and do some copy paste. Oh, and you'll notice when instruments launched, it also launched the simulator. So this window right here is the iPhone simulator. So I'm going to scale it up to full size and we get the pretty border, which I know is what everybody really is worried about. And so this is a test app. The test app works really simply. You give it two numbers, you push a button, and it adds. I did math. Thank you, thank you. I can't take credit for writing this. I did not write it. Did you write it? Okay, so he's not.
Well, I wrote it.
Okay, he wrote it. He did math. He has created math. So I'm going to paste some commands in here. So this is the first command that actually interacts with Appium. You'll notice it's pointed at port 4723. And if I go over here, you'll see that it received a post, and it responded appropriately with a 303 to redirect to the new session. So now we can start interacting with the app. So first let's grab some fields. Oh, why did you break? Ah, I know why.
What was that you said about Untitled Chapter?
Yeah. I deserve that one. So it worked that time. Sweating a little bit now. Nothing like a live demo going wrong to get the blood going. So let's look on the other side at what actually happened. It is just sending JSON wire protocol requests to Appium. So this is just using the Selenium WebDriver wire protocol. And Appium is taking that command and passing it to instruments to interact with the app. So if we go back over to Python here and we actually inspect that, we have two web element objects that were returned. We can look at them and get, for example, the ID for one of them. That's a unique identifier. It identifies that field in this app, period.
Can you bring your terminal window up a little bit? It's like if you're wasting on.
Yeah. I'm going to do this the easy way. So you guys can see .id gives everything. Yeah.
So basically what's, I understand correctly, what's happening here is Appium is kind of like a shit, which is taking what the instruments.app presents to it and then making it look like WebDriver.
Yeah, that's not altogether inaccurate. In fact, that's pretty good. So we're going to do some math with the command line. So by sending some keys in, finding a button, and clicking on the button. Uh-oh. Nope, okay, we're good. I have done math. But that's actually not the most interesting part here. Oh, I have no idea what I just did. Yeah, sure I did. There we go. Okay. What's actually really interesting is when you pass Appium. When you pass in Appium.py, when you pass this to Appium.py, what it's going to do is, my terminal hates me. Again, it's going to launch instruments just like before, but instead of giving us a server back that we can interact with, we have a UI automation command prompt. So what we can do here is we can send UI automation commands, and it will eval them and give us the results. So I want to do the exact same thing I did before, but what I'm doing this time is I'm passing this JavaScript in instead. So these are UI automation JavaScript commands. And what you'll notice right away is if I switch over to the simulator, it's working exactly the same. And that's because all I'm really doing is taking the WebDriver API and wrapping these commands. But where that's useful, why this is useful to be a way to interact, is that you can do things like this. You can write a test, pause it, drop into the interpreter, and interact with this. And it'll return things like the value to your command line. So you can debug your test this way. It's really, really useful. Okay, and then what's really cool is, since you're using instruments, you have these trace files that are created whenever you interact. So I can open up that trace, and it's going to show me the session that I just had. So if I open my trace log here, you'll see at the bottom, there's all the different instructions that I sent, and all the commands and the results from them. So you get everything that instruments offer, some of which is really cool, but it's wrapped in a neat, shiny package, like sitting under the tree at Christmas. All right. Any questions about the demo? It's pretty straightforward. So here's some problems. It doesn't support execute script yet. There's some ways to get around this. What I mean when I say it doesn't support execute script, obviously it doesn't support execute script in the context of like the app I just demoed. That would be nonsense. But if you have a UI web view in your application, you can't just use execute script to execute arbitrary JavaScript in that UI web view. That is definitely something that we're trying to make work.
What is execute script?
What is execute script? Execute script takes a JavaScript string command, and then it evals it in the context of the UI web view. So you would use this when you needed to prep an app, usually. You're usually using this for shortcutting testing or to mock things out to pretend that you've done stuff. So you can't do that. There's a 1 second delay between commands. So if you were watching the prompt, you noticed that it took about a second to get results back. That's just a limitation for UI automation. I don't know if it's a bug or if it's just the way they built it. And I'd really love somebody at Apple to give me a firm answer because I've heard both ways. The good news is with a native app, since you have a lot of animations and transitions in your app, this isn't as big of a deal as you might think. But we are working on ways around this. There's one way to get around it that Dan uses, is boxcarring commands. So you just take a batch of commands and you send them all at the same time, and it executes them in sequence, and you only incur that penalty one time. Probably the worst part is it's still using UI automation down at the bottom. But you know what? That's not really avoidable in this case. If you don't use UI automation, you're not getting that first-class citizen, officially supported touch framework like you get with using instruments. So this is what I really wanted to talk about. All of that is just context. What's the next generation of tools look like? So let's assume for a second that Appium's great and it's the perfect tool for testing native apps, and we have a solution. What do we have to do now? Well, we have to build Android tools, but I'm going to assume that happened too. What else do we do? I think the most interesting of all of the things that are going on right now is some work around the WebKit debugging protocol. So does anybody know what this is? Yeah, nobody ever knows what this is. Has anybody here ever used the Chrome DevTools? Okay, you've used the WebKit remote debugging protocol. Congratulations. What it is it's a JSON API that is exposed via a WebSocket on a web page in Chrome or Safari, basically any WebKit browser. That includes mobile Chrome and mobile Safari and UI web views. And it's a privileged WebSocket, but it's a documented protocol that you can connect to and use. Why is this important? Well, it's most important because it enables us to have a way to talk to a web page, like in actual mobile Safari, without going through Apple's framework to do so. So we could actually write a WebDriver client for Safari that used the remote web debugging protocol and use that as Safari driver. So, yeah, like I said, driving mobile Safari would be huge. Why? Well, you get Nitro. You would have this rendering in the actual browser instead of a UI web view. There's a lot of benefits to it. Yes?
So I think with one downside there would be that would work in web views, like in hybrid app. It would also work in hybrid app because I think on Android they have this feature in Chrome for Android, but it doesn't. It's only for Chrome for Android. It's not for the web view portion. Yeah.
So that's really interesting. You're right. It doesn't work in UI web views by default, but you can actually turn it on. And so most people have a testing target for their apps when they write apps. They have the regular target, they have a debug target that has all their debugging information, so that when something breaks, they get a huge spew. As part of having a testing target, you would just add one line, which doesn't modify the behavior of the app in any way except opening the support. So just do that, and then it works. So it's pretty powerful. And actually, if you wanted to give that a shot, most UI web views will work on the old version of this. By default, it's turned on. So you can use iWeb Inspector to interact with that. If you go look at the Mobile Test Summit YouTube page, I gave a lightning talk there about using Safari DevTools. And Safari DevTools connect to UI web views using the same protocol. But yeah, that highlights another point. In addition to driving mobile Safari, we could drive desktop Safari too. And if you use the Safari driver for Mac, you know it is a total pain in the butt to set up. You have to compile the extension, and you have to code sign it, and then you can finally put it into your browser. So if you don't have a developer account, sorry, hard to do. So this would give us a way to drive desktop Safari without having to do that. It would also let us drive Chrome on Android, which is huge, because right now there's no WebDriver for Chrome, although I hear that's coming, which would be great. And then probably the big thing, right? If this worked, This works on Android web views as well, assuming you turn them on. And it would work for Chrome for Android, but it wouldn't solve the problem that we have of running functional tests on Android. For that, we would need something, I kind of smirkingly call it Android RC, after Selenium RC. And if you've interacted at all with the Robotium project, you know that's sort of their goal. Take the Android testing framework, wrap it reasonably, and then expose an API that can be used to remote control Android. I think this is probably the next big step that needs to happen in the testing community, is somebody needs to put a first-class tool together to allow remote control for Android devices. So I think the way for this is pretty clear. Android's provided a good testing framework that's written in a normal language that doesn't have all the limitations of UI automation. Somebody just needs to come along and make the remote control part work. So, any questions? Yeah?
Is that something you?
You know, I have some pretty good ideas about how to do that. I'm probably going to be playing with that.
Has anybody tried to make this stuff run in like an EC2 instance?
What do you mean by that?
Well, I'd love to not have to depend on my local machines to like run a functional test of an iOS app.
Yeah. So let me show you something about that. It's funny you asked that. I had this open in the background. So this is what we are doing at Sauce. This is Appium running in our cloud. So you just run your functional test, and for your command executor, you pass in the on-demand at .sauce and give it an app, and it works. So yeah, people are doing that.
I saw your announcement about this, and it's really exciting. And I was wondering how you get around Apple's licensing. How do you?
What we do right now is we just work with .apps. So we have you zip that folder up, and we download it at test runtime. So there's no signing around .apps. That means it's only running in the emulator right now, or the simulator. Real devices, I don't know what we're going to do yet. We're going to have to work that out. That's a tough problem. Any other questions?
So you mentioned the WebKit remote debugger as a good way to drive Chrome and web views. What's stopping us from doing that right now?
I think the approach was something that came out of the Mobile Test Summit. Francois Renaud, who wrote iOS Driver and he works at eBay, he's got this working. So if you look up the iOS Driver project, iOS-Driver on GitHub, he's got maybe 30, 40 commits into this project and making it work. So like he's actually got it so that he's got information out of iframes and he can click buttons in iframes. So he's already farther ahead of it than the WebDriver. Yeah.
Quick question is, on your demo you just displayed debugging using the JavaScripts.
Yeah.
Why are we confined to the JavaScript and not to the WebDriver scripts?
Oh, you can totally do WebDriver too.
Okay.
What that's really useful for is, especially if you're working on the Appium to commit, I think the main reason it's there is so you can tweak the JavaScript a little bit either way and see how it behaves. Because what you can do in Appium is if you actually call execute script and you pass it something, it passes that on to the instruments instance, or it will eventually if it doesn't right now. And so what the interpreter for JavaScript lets you do is actually play with the UI automation framework directly and see, it's a debugging tool, right? Is this Appium's fault? Is this UI automation's fault? Well, there's an easy way to find out. Just run the direct command there, and if it fails, then you know it's not Appium. Any other questions?
Has anybody tried, like, what's the company that does the jailbreaking? Selenium or Selenium?
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. Cydia?
Cydia.
Yeah.
Has anybody tried, like, bytecode injection into an app? You know, basically do some brain surgery on the app instead of going through the automation API.
So how would that work exactly?
It would be similar to how, like, Selenium 1 worked, where it injected the JavaScript daemon into the page.
Yeah. I mean, effectively, that's what UI automation does. There's a framework called public automation where they've basically reverse engineered the UI automation touch framework. And there are some tools that use that framework, but they all require having an HTTP server embedded in your app. So, you know, at that point, a lot of people can't use it.
Yeah, work on the iframe.
For WebDriver,
Yeah.
not that I know of. The person to ask is Luke Inman-Semmerau. He's on IRC all the time. He's Luke IS. He presented on iWebDriver in San Jose and at the Mobile Summit, and both times he spoke of this as if it were, you know, God's writ that it does not work. I'll tell you though, the way around it ultimately is the remote debugging protocol. That'll get us around it at the end of the day.
You know how you can use click app and Selenium WebDriver? Can you use like those same functions for Appium?
So Appium only implements about 20% of the WebDriver protocol right now. Click on element works, but clicking an arbitrary place does not. However, that should totally be possible. Instruments has every idea of the grid and it knows coordinates. So you should totally be able to put arbitrary clicking in. Is that
Swipe.
Yeah. Oh, and touch actions should totally be possible.
Someone implemented those yesterday.
Touch actions?
Swipe and click.
Was it Igor?
It was Roman.
Roman. Okay. So there you go. Swipe and flick are already in. Wish I'd known that last time.
Too long. Yeah, probably that.
Yeah. And I have a local commit that adds screenshotting. So
Could you provide any comparison with this and Calabash?
yeah, Calabash requires an HTTP server. I don't know what libraries it uses. I know that a lot of people use Cucumber. It falls under the native driver model, so all of my comments about the native driver model would apply here. So Calabash on iOS, though, I think that those guys are basically backing away from that project. I think they're no longer really interested in that. I think that they're throwing in with the Frank guys. So as far as Android, I don't know too much about it. I know it's a decent tool to use, but it's not one that I'm really interested in at this point. For all the reasons I was talking about before.
I think it's
Yeah, go.
Yeah, I think it's any similar tool like Selenium IDE for recording user actions.
No, there's not yet, although Instruments has some interesting things you can do with it, so I would look there first.
You can record an instrument.
Yeah, you can record an Instruments, I think. So I would say try that. Try just recording it through Instruments.
So have you done any work on the Accelerator Titanium platform?
Yeah, I have not directly, but I've talked to some people who have tried, and so far I think everything just works fine. Accelerator is UI web views though, right? They're hybrid apps, they're JavaScript based and HTML.
They do both.
They do both. So for the UI web view stuff, you've got iWebDriver. For the rest, I mean, their stuff is a framework that's built in Objective-C, so it does ultimately work as long as you're really careful about accessibility stuff. Because what's happening, the reason accessibility is so important is that like the labels that are on all these elements only ever exist if you set accessibility stuff. If you don't set accessibility up, they don't exist. Anyone else? Yeah.
For unit testing, using like unit test engine, is it like the same process like the testing from the user interface, like compared to
It should work exactly the same as WebDriver. So if you have WebDriver tests for iPhone or Android, or you have WebDriver tests for Firefox, the same basic test harness should work for Appium and for that, which is the whole point of using Appium, is that all your Selenium stuff should just work. And we have people who are using this who have successfully started migrating their Selenium scripts for their website, their mobile website, over to their native app because they're very, very similar. And they're basically reusing the same code. So they're almost running Selenium test scripts on mobile without modifying.
Are you doing any asserts? Because I see you running things, but you didn't say, make sure
Right.
you get 10 on.
Yeah. The asserts are all handled by the test framework, so that's all Python side. So Appium can handle that because Appium doesn't touch. Only the WebDriver commands are going to get sent through asserts. So. So yeah, I could have just added a cert in front of grabbing that value, and it would have worked just fine.
So I don't know if this answers your first question, like the recorder and the mobile, but why can't, maybe, is this a solution, a possibility where you just will record in your web, like on the desktop, and then I can just convert those tests to your mobile device?
Dan, do you know the answer to that?
There's a easy automation widget in instruments, and there's like a report button, and then you'll display this out in JavaScript.
And does that JavaScript run?
You can run a request.
Yeah, so theoretically you could use that to, grab the commands that you wanted and then convert them over.
Or you can just run.
Yeah, or you can just run them.
There ought to be a time when we don't have to worry about native apps, just, HTML5
I suspect the answer is no. The reason is there's always going to be people who want performance, and there are always going to be people who are pushing the boundaries of what the device can do. And when you're pushing the limits, the halfway approach, which is sort of the compromise approach of hybrid, isn't going to fly. I think Facebook has proven that pretty well, that native is going to always be the choice for certain people. Facebook is a good example of that. They needed a really performant app that scaled to enormous amounts of data for a handheld device. I think that for people like you and me, yeah, UI web views are going to be really popular. They're not going anywhere. So I'm writing an iOS app to learn, to get my hands dirty with this stuff, and I'm going to use UI web views because I don't really want to have to learn that much Objective-C.
What are the CI tools that integrate with Appium?
With Appium? Again, it's basically everything that can work with the Selenium grid is architected to work with Appium. Unfortunately, like I said before, Appium's Selenium grid support isn't implemented yet, but it's the kind of thing that you can do over a weekend. It's just not a ton of work. It's Selenium WebDriver at the core, so it just needs to have, it just needs to have some support added for sessions and things like that. But I mean, as you can see, we have it running in Sauce Cloud, so it can be done.
So eventually, as part of the next generation of test tools, that Android was something that Google wanted to develop.
Yeah.
And then, in the same breath, you were speaking about Appium. So does that mean that you kind of see Appium extending to Android in such that it's almost a similar way, not the same way that it supports instrument.app, where basically Monkey Runner is kind of starting the same fashion?
That's what I'd love to see happen, frankly, is I think that a remote control that uses Monkey Runner is probably the way to go. And the main reason for that is I just hate the idea that we're synthesizing events. Because you don't really know, a synthesized swipe isn't going to behave exactly the same as a real swipe. And I think it's just really important that we have that support for first-class tools. Monkey Runner provides that for the most part, so I think that's sort of what I'm advocating in my talk is, hey, this approach of wrapping those tools to make them more accessible is the right approach. So I would love to see that. And whether it ends up in Appium or not is sort of irrelevant to me.
I think part of the consideration there is that you're going to write a wrapper or for the initialization native tool that you have to be careful that there aren't any unforeseen circumstances or kind of you're going to do performance degradation while you're translating over to the WebDriver kind of interface.
Totally agree. Totally agree. That's something we have already started to run into with this because of the one-sided delay. Although that's there no matter what, so. Yeah, work with what you can get, exactly.
Francois actually didn't find a way around that.
He will. Yeah, he did.
You set your system clock for a second.
Yeah, so Francois took the same approach. And his approach is every time he runs a command, he sets the system clock forward 9 tenths of a second.
What's your Apple things?
I'm sure they love that. They just love that. Anything else? All right. I'm going to go ahead and post my slides up afterward and send a link to them. There's a resource page at the end. So please check it out. There's a link to the Appium repo. There's 2 talks here that are on this approach to automation. Dan Cuellar right there gave a talk at the Mobile Summit, and Francois gave a talk at the Mobile Summit, and those talks are great for kind of understanding the approach. Dan gives some pretty cool detail as to why Appium is hacktastic. And then at the bottom, I included a link to a blog by Simon Stewart where he kind of talks about how we should be conceiving of mobile testing and why WebDriver is a good tool for that. So please check these out. Cool, that's it. Thank you.